Okay. We marched out in great strength and splendor, and took the roads toward Orleans. Orleans. The initial part of Joan's great dream was realizing itself at last. It was the first time that any of us youngsters had ever seen an army, and it was a most stately and imposing spectacle to us. It was indeed an inspiring sight, that stretching away into the fading distance and curving itself like a mighty serpent. Joan rode at the head of it with her personal staff. Then came a body of priests singing the Veni Creator, the banner of the cross rising out of their midst. After these, the glinting forest of spears. The several divisions were commanded by the great Armagnac generals, La Hire, the Marshal du Bouzac, the Sire de Retz, the Sire de Retz, Florent Villiers, and Porthon de Saint-Charles. Each in his degree was tough, and there were 3 degrees: tough, tougher, and toughest. And La Hire was the last by a shade, but only a shade. They were just illustrious official brigands, the whole party, and by long habits of lawlessness they had lost all acquaintanceship with obedience, if they ever had it. The king's strict orders to them had been, obey the general-in-chief in everything, attempt nothing without her knowledge, do nothing without her command. But what was the good of saying that? These independent birds knew no law. They seldom obeyed the king, and they never obeyed him when it didn't suit them to do it. Would they obey the maid? In the first place, they wouldn't know how to obey her or anybody else. And in the second place, it was of course not possible for them to take her military character seriously. The country girl of 17 who had been trained for the complex and terrible business of war. How? By tending sheep? They had no idea of obeying her except in cases where their veteran military knowledge and experience showed them that the thing she required was sound and right, when gauged by the regular military standards. Were they to blame for this attitude? I should think not. Old war-worn captains are hard-headed, practical men. They do not easily believe in the ability of ignorant children to plan campaigns and command armies. No general that ever lived could have taken Joan seriously, militarily, before she raised the siege of Orleans and followed it with the great campaign of Blois. Did they consider Joan valueless? Far from it. They valued her as the fruitful earth values the sun. They fully believed she could produce the crop, but that it was in their line of business, not hers, to take it off. They had a deep and superstitious reverence for her as being endowed with a mysterious supernatural something that was able to do a mighty thing which they were powerless to do. Blow the breath of life and valor into the dead corpses of cowed armies and turn them into heroes. To their mind, they were everything with her, but nothing without her. She could inspire the soldiers and fit them for battle, but fight the battle herself? Oh, nonsense. That was their function. They, the generals, would fight the battles. Joan would give the victory. That was the idea, an unconscious paraphrase of Joan's reply to the Dominican. So they began by playing a deception upon her. She had a clear idea of how she meant to proceed. It was her purpose to march boldly upon Orleans by the north bank of the Loire. She gave that order to her generals. They said to themselves, the idea is insane. It is a blunder. Number one, it is what might have been expected by this child who was ignorant of war. They privately sent the word to the Bastard of Orleans. He also recognized the insanity of it, at least he thought he did, and privately advised the generals to get around the order in some way. They did it by deceiving Joan. She trusted those people, and she was not expecting this sort of treatment, and was not on the lookout for it. It was a lesson to her. She saw to it that the game was not played a second time. Why was Joan's idea insane? From the general's point of view, but not from her. Because her plan was to raise the siege immediately by fighting, while theirs was to besiege the besiegers and starve them out of the closing their communications, a plan which would require months in its consummation. The English had built a fence of strong fortresses called bastilles around Orleans, fortresses which closed all the gates of the city but one. To the French generals, the idea of trying to fight their way past those fortresses and lead the army into Orleans was preposterous. They believed that the result would be the army's destruction. One may not doubt that their opinion was militarily sound. No, would have been, but for one circumstance which they overlooked. Soldiers were in a demoralized condition of superstitious terror. They had become satisfied that the Maid was in league with Satan. By reason of this, a good deal of their courage had oozed out and vanished. On the other hand, the Maid soldiers were full of courage, enthusiasm, and zeal. Joan could have searched by the English forts. Joan could have marched by the English forts. However, it was not to be. She had been cheated out of her first chance to strike a heavy blow for her country. In camp that night, she slept in her armor on the ground. It was a cold night, and she was nearly as stiff as the armor itself when we resumed the march in the morning. For iron is not good material for a blanket. However, her joy as being now so far on her way to the theater of her mission was fire enough to warm her, and it soon did. However, her joy in being now so far on her way to the theater of her mission was fire enough to warm her, and it soon did. Her enthusiasm and impatience rose higher and higher with every mile of progress. But at last we reached Olivet, and down it we went, and indignation took its place. For she saw the trick that had been played upon her. The river lay between us and Orleans. She was for attacking one of the three bastilles that were on our side of the river and forcing access to the bridge, which is guarded instantly. But the long ingrained fear of the English came upon her generals, and they implored her not to make the attempt. The soldiers wanted to attack, but not to suffer disappointment. So he moved on and came to a halt at a point opposite Chéchy, 6 miles above Orleans. Dunois, bastard of Orleans, was a body of knights and citizens came up from their city to welcome Joan. Joan was still burning with resentment over the trick that had been put upon her, and was not in the mood for softly said, "Are you the bastards of Orleans?" "Yes, I am, and I am right glad of you coming. And did you advise that I be brought by this side of the river instead of straight to Talbot and the English?" Her high manner abashed him, and he was not able to answer with anything like a confident promptness, but with many hesitations and partial excuses. He managed to get out the confession that for what he and the council had regarded